We now turn to the second part of our look at equality, looking at equality involving race and ethnicity. The essay that we'll look at for this, or the reading for this, is the famous I Have a Dream speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. First, a little background for Dr. King. He was born in Atlanta on January 15, 1929. He married Coretta Scott on June 18, 1953, and he was assassinated on April 4, 1968. In terms of his education, in 1948, he received a BA in sociology from Morehouse College. He was rejected by Yale Divinity, and no doubt they regret doing that to this day. In 1951, he received a Bachelor of Divinity from Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. In 1955, he received a PhD in Systematic Theology from Boston University. He is a man of many accomplishments. He is a Nobel laureate, a Baptist minister, a civil rights activist, and one of the most significant American leaders in the 20th century and perhaps of all time. He developed the method of civil disobedience into an effective tool of social change. And as we'll see when we look at the notion of obedience in our final part, the notion of civil disobedience originated in the United States with the work of Henry David Thoreau, was adopted by Gandhi in India, and then returned to the United States to be employed by Dr. King. Now, as I mentioned, the reading for this section is the classic I Have a Dream speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is delivered on the steps at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963. Now, what Dr. King does is takes an approach to this matter by looking at, it from a historical perspective, looking at it from a moral perspective, and addressing pretty much all the key points when we look at in regards to matters of oppression and inequality. Now, the date, August 28, 1963, is of historical importance because 100 years before then, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. But Dr. King uses this time as an opportunity to look at what has not changed or what has not improved since 1863. And of course, we're looking at it now from the perspective, now in 2013, we're looking back to 1963, and which is exactly 50 years from now. And of course, he was looking back 100 years. And so we're looking back 50, he's looking back 100. And so it's interesting to consider not only the changes since 1863 to 1963, but also the changes from 1963 to 2013. And of course, it is also worth considering what has not changed since 1963. Now, Dr. King notes that there is still a lack of freedom, that there's still points of considerable concern, namely this. He focuses first on the notion of a lack of freedom, second, on the problems of segregation, and thirdly, the problems of discrimination. And he also adds the matter of poverty. And so we find, as we see in matters of equality, we saw as well as gender equality, that there are those concerns, namely the matter of poverty and how it relates to oppression, and also, of course, in the case of matters of race, the problem of segregation and discrimination. Now, the basis for Dr. King's claim that, in terms of the ethics of it, he's applying a method we looked at back in the beginning known as consistent application. The idea, essentially, as we saw, is that morally, when one is a set of principles, they have to be applied consistently. And what he essentially is doing is arguing that based on the principles of the United States, they're being applied inconsistently. And to be specific, he contends that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are a promissory note to Americans. What was promised? Well, what was promised was not segregation or discrimination, but what was promised was inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And, as Dr. King notes, America has defaulted on this promissory note to her citizens of color. Now, he draws an interesting analogy. He says that America has given people a bad check, which has come back marked insufficient funds. But he refuses to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. He refuses to believe there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity. And his view is that he has come to cash this check that will give us the riches of freedom and the security of justice. So as he sees it, to recap, there are the following key problems: segregation, discrimination, lack of freedom, and poverty. The basis for his moral claim is that the Constitution and Declaration of Independence lay out these rights: the rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and to fail to apply them to everyone as promised is a moral failing. And so that's the problems as he sees them. Now, in regards to matters of repression, one very critical question is, when you're advocating change against this system of repression, discrimination, segregation, etc., there is the question of when should the change take place? And there are two conflicting schools, to sort of simplify the matter, in this regard. Now, on one hand, there is what's known as gradualism. The idea is essentially to have a slow change, a slow progress. And of course, the alternative is to have change now, or in the words of Dr. King, the fierce urgency of now. Now, his view is that we should not accept this tranquilizing drug of gradualism. And perhaps his reasoning is based on what gradualism usually leads to, which is, of course, a very slow change, or perhaps no change whatsoever. Now, as he sees it, it would be a fatal mistake to overlook the urgency of the moment. Now, so essentially his point of contention is basically this. The alternatives, again, are gradualism and making the change now. In terms of the gradualism, the problem is that slow may lead to never, and of course, as he notes, there is the urgency of the moment. And the obvious concern is that if things are not addressed and corrected, that things would turn out very badly indeed, that there would be revolt and shaking the foundations of the nation until justice emerges. So in terms of the when, his answer to that question is now, not a gradual change of the sort that was advocated over the centuries. And of course, this is regarded by some as simply a delaying action to hold off change for as long as possible. Now, a second point of concern is, after the when, the matter of how. Namely, how does one bring about this change? Now, just as with the when, there are two main alternatives. One, of course, is the classic by any means necessary, which presumably can include violence. The alternative is nonviolence. Now, Dr. King makes the following moral argument as to why it should be nonviolent. Now, he states that in order to gain one's rightful place, one must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. And so his view is that since it's a moral struggle, the struggle should be conducted on a high plane of dignity and discipline, not degenerate into physical violence. And his view is to meet physical force with soul force. And so, in regards to the methodology, what he advocates is not violence, but a method of civil disobedience, a method of nonviolence. Now, he also addresses here a point of considerable concern in any case where you have a system of oppression, especially something systematic and brutal as racism in the United States. Namely, what relation can the group that has been oppressed have with the group that has provided the oppression? Well, some people advocate, a separation, namely that, there's no way to have the problem effectively solved without, splitting apart, the races. Now, King's view is that despite the terrible history, his view is that one should not distrust all white people. Why? Well, his reasoning is twofold. First, as he notes in 1963, there were white people who showed up, for the event, showing that they have realized, in terms of a second reason, that is the destiny of all Americans is tied together, that the freedom of one is tied to the freedom of all. And so his view is that this should be done in a peaceful manner, and it should not involve this separation, distrust, and splitting. So his view is that what should be done is a marching ahead, not turning back, and what has to be done is address the core problems, namely lack of mobility, issues with voting, and of course, getting back to sort of the point of what has changed since then, what are things like now. It is certainly a matter of interest and concern that in 1963, Dr. King raises concerns about voting, and then we find in 2012 concerns about voting raised again. Various concerns about disenfranchising voters through various means, echoing the matters of the 60s. And so we see that this matter, this concern about the right to vote, is still one that's relevant today, as are matters of discrimination and segregation. Now, of course, he closes with his invocation of the dream, namely that calls upon America to rise up and to live up to its moral principle, to be consistent, to not simply say the words, but fail to act upon them. And the words are, of course, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. In his view, is that someday, regardless of race, people will be able to sit down together at a table of brotherhood. And it is, perhaps his most famous quote, is that he hopes that one day his children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so his hope is that there will be justice. Now, of course, this raises, to go back to sort of the start, this does raise many interesting points of concern today. Namely, again, he's writing, rather speaking in 1963, 50 years ago, reflecting on, 150 years ago from today, the Emancipation Proclamation. And so it does raise those questions. Is segregation still a problem today? Is discrimination still a problem today? Is poverty still a problem today? Is the matter of voting rights still a problem today? And so it's an interesting point of reflection to consider what has changed since then and what still needs to change if the dream is going to become a reality. And that brings us to the end of looking at Dr. Martin Luther King and his famous I Have a Dream speech.